You'll always be a failure. My brother laughed at my life. But now he's broke and desperate. I always knew my brother was the favorite. It wasn't something my parents ever admitted out loud, but it was obvious in everything they did. Jake, the golden child, the prodigy, the one they pinned all their hopes and dreams on. He was smart, charismatic, and ambitious, or at least, that's how they saw him. In reality, he was arrogant, entitled, and had everything handed to him on a silver platter. Meanwhile, I was the afterthought, the one they barely acknowledged unless it was to criticize me. Growing up, it was always about Jake. When he got good grades, they threw him a party. When I got good grades, they barely noticed. He got the latest gadgets, the best clothes, a brand new car when he turned 16. I got whatever was left over. I still remember my 16th birthday. My parents took Jake out to celebrate his college acceptance while I sat at home with a store-bought cake and a half-hearted happy birthday from my grandmother. Jake never let me forget that he was better than me. He treated me like a loser, like I was beneath him. He would mock me for my interests, call my ambitions pathetic, and constantly remind me that I would never be as successful as him. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that one day I'd prove him wrong, but it was hard when everyone around me seemed to agree with him. By the time we reached adulthood, our paths had diverged completely. Jake went to an expensive university, fully funded by our parents, and walked straight into a cushy job at a prestigious firm thanks to one of my dad's connections. He lived in a high-rise apartment, drove a luxury car, and traveled the world. And me? I was working 2 jobs, trying to pay off my student loans because my parents refused to help me with college. Maybe if you had chosen a real degree, we would have considered it, my dad told me when I asked. A real degree. That's what they called Jake's business major. Meanwhile, my passion for technology and entrepreneurship was dismissed as a waste of time. I had always been fascinated by coding, by building software, by the potential of startups. But to my parents, if I wasn't working a traditional job with a guaranteed paycheck, I was a failure. Jake made sure to rub it in every chance he got. Every holiday, every family gathering, he would casually drop hints about how much money he was making, the exclusive events he attended, the high-profile people he met. And, of course, he'd make sure to throw in a few jabs at me. "You still working at that little company?" He asked me one Thanksgiving, smirking. "Must be tough, man. Maybe one day you'll make enough to move out of that tiny apartment." My parents laughed. I clenched my jaw and forced a smile. But I never forgot. I didn't just sit around feeling sorry for myself. I worked hard. Every spare moment I had, I was building something. I spent years refining my ideas, developing software, making connections. It wasn't easy. There were times I thought about giving up, times I wondered if maybe they were right, if I really was wasting my time. Then, everything changed. The startup I had been working on finally took off. It wasn't overnight success. It was years of grinding, of failures, of learning from my mistakes. But when it happened, it was bigger than I ever could have imagined. Investors came knocking. Clients lined up. The revenue skyrocketed. And suddenly, the kid who was mocked for playing with computers was being invited to tech conferences, appearing in business magazines, and negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. I didn't tell my family. I let them believe I was still struggling. Let them think I was still that same loser they had written off years ago. And the best part? Jake had no idea. He was too busy flaunting his wealth, too absorbed in his own little world to pay attention to what I was doing. Every time I saw him, he'd make some condescending comment about my career, assuming I was still scraping by. "Man, I don't know how you do it," he said once, shaking his head as he sipped his expensive whiskey. I couldn't live like that. I need the finer things in life, you know? I just smiled, because I knew something he didn't. His perfect little world, it wasn't going to last forever. Jake had always been reckless with money. He spent more than he made, trying to keep up appearances. He leased cars he couldn't afford, lived in an apartment that cost more than some people's mortgages, and acted like his income was unlimited. And for a while, he got away with it. Until he didn't. It started with whispers, rumors that his company was downsizing, that layoffs were coming. Then, one day it happened. Jake lost his job. At first, he acted like it was nothing. "Just a temporary setback," he told everyone. "I'll have another offer in no time." But weeks passed, then months, and no offers came. His severance ran out. His savings, what little he had, disappeared. The fancy car was repossessed. The high-rise apartment? Gone. The vacations, the expensive nights out, the designer clothes, it all vanished. And for the first time in his life, Jake was struggling. That's when the calls started. First, he called our parents, expecting them to bail him out like they always had. But they weren't as financially stable as they used to be. They had spent too much supporting his lifestyle, and now they couldn't afford to help him. So he called me. I still remember the first time he reached out. I saw his name on my phone and just stared at it for a moment, letting the irony sink in. The same brother who had mocked me for years was now asking for my help. I didn't answer. Not yet. I wanted to see just how far he would fall. Jake didn't give up easily. The first call went unanswered, but that didn't stop him from trying again. And again. At first, he was subtle about it. Just casual messages, acting like nothing had changed. Hey, man, it's been a while. We should catch up. As if we were ever close. I ignored him. A few days later, another text. You busy? Let's grab a drink, my treat. I smirked at the irony. The man who used to flaunt his wealth now trying to bait me with an offer he clearly couldn't afford. I let him wait. Then the messages got more direct. Listen, I could use a little help. Nothing big. Just something to get me back on my feet. Ah, there it was. I debated responding, but something in me told me to wait. To let him sweat a little more. And I was right to. Because soon, the messages took a different tone. Jake was unraveling. His pride, once so impenetrable, was cracking. Mom and Dad can't help me. Things are bad. I just need a loan. Please. Please. The golden child was begging. I still didn't answer. I wanted him to feel it. The desperation. The hopelessness. The same emotions I had felt when I was drowning, when I had no one to turn to. When he was too busy mocking me to even notice that I was struggling. And then, after weeks of silence, my phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't Jake. It was my mother. I already knew why she was calling before I even picked up. Sweetheart, she began, her voice overly sweet, laced with something I recognized immediately, guilt. How have you been? It feels like we haven't talked in ages. Right, because she suddenly cared now. I've been busy, I replied simply. She sighed, as if this whole conversation was exhausting for her. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something important. It's about Jake. There it was. I leaned back in my chair, letting her continue. He's going through a really tough time, she said, her voice dipping into that soft, pitiful tone. He lost his job, and, well, things haven't been easy for him. He made some mistakes, but he's still your brother. I know he reached out, and I think it would mean a lot if you could help him. I waited a beat before responding. You mean the way he helped me? She hesitated. That's not fair. You know things were different back then. Different how? I asked, my voice calm. Because when I was struggling, when I needed support, he laughed in my face. And you let him? That's not. She started, but I cut her off. Where was this concern when I was working 2 jobs just to survive? When I asked for help, you told me I needed to be more like him. When I was scraping by, he made it his personal mission to humiliate me. And now that he's lost everything, I'm supposed to forget all that. She sighed again, this time in frustration. He's your brother. Family takes care of each other. I let out a sharp laugh. Funny, that's not what you said when I needed you. Silence stretched between us. Then, her voice turned colder. I didn't realize you could be so cruel. Ah, there it was. The guilt trip. The attempt to flip the script and make me the villain for refusing to be used. I'm not being cruel, I said evenly. I'm just giving him the same support he gave me. More silence. Then, finally, she sighed. I hope you can live with yourself. And then she hung up. I stared at my phone for a moment before setting it down, shaking my head. Live with myself? I had never felt more at peace. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Because if Jake was desperate enough to send our mother after me, then he was desperate enough to try something even worse. And I was right. Because a week later, he showed up at my door. I wasn't surprised to see him standing there. Jake, once the golden child, now looked like a shell of the man he used to be. His once expensive suit was wrinkled, a size too big, like he had lost weight from stress. The arrogance that used to ooze from him was gone. Instead, he looked nervous, desperate. For a brief moment, I just stood there, staring at him. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Hey, I didn't move. What do you want, Jake? He let out a forced chuckle, as if trying to act like this was just a normal visit between brothers. Come on, man. Can't I just stop by to see you? I didn't answer. He sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. Okay, fine. Look, I know things have been rough between us. I know I wasn't always the best brother. I raised an eyebrow. Is that what you call it? His jaw tightened, but he quickly forced a smile, pretending like my words didn't sting. Look, I screwed up, all right. I get it, but I'm trying to fix things. And honestly, I could use some help right now. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Help? He exhaled. Yeah, just a small loan. Just to get me back on my feet. I swear, I'll pay you back as soon as I get things figured out. I almost laughed. Jake had never been good at reading people. He thought his usual charm would work on me, that I would forget everything just because he was finally on the receiving end of hardship. I tilted my head, pretending to think. Let me get this straight. You want me to give you money? After years of mocking me? After watching me struggle and doing absolutely nothing to help? His face darkened slightly. Come on, man. That was years ago. Oh, I remember, I said. I remember every time you laughed at me for being broke. Every time you flaunted your money in my face. Every time you made sure I knew I was nothing compared to you. His fists clenched. I get it, all right. I was a dick. But this isn't about the past. This is about family. And right now, I need my brother. I exhaled slowly, looking at him for a long moment. Where were you when I needed my brother? His mouth opened, then shut. He had no answer. I took a step back. You should go, Jake. His eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't actually considered that I would say no. Wait, just think about it, okay? We're still family. We're supposed to help each other. I shook my head. That's funny. You never seemed to care about that when you were the one on top. He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I shut the door behind him and let out a slow breath. That should have been the end of it. But I knew my brother, and he wasn't done yet. Because when people like Jake lose power, they don't just accept it. They try to take it back, even if it means burning every bridge along the way. I knew Jake wouldn't let things go that easily. He had spent his entire life getting what he wanted, manipulating situations to his advantage. He wasn't the type to just accept defeat and move on. I was right. A few days later, my parents called again. I let it go to voicemail. Then they texted, then called again. This time, I answered. Are you happy? My mother's voice snapped the moment I picked up. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice calm. Hello to you too, Mom. Don't be smart with me, she hissed. Your brother came to you for help, and you turned him away? He's your blood. I sighed. And where was my blood when I needed help? He's struggling, she continued, ignoring my words. We raised you better than this. Family takes care of each other. I let out a humorless laugh. You mean like how you took care of me? She didn't like that. That's different. It's not different. I interrupted, my patience wearing thin. When I was struggling, when I asked for support, you told me to figure it out on my own. You told me I should be more like Jake. So I did. I figured it out on my own. And now that he's failing, you expect me to save him. She was silent for a moment, then she scoffed. I didn't realize you could be so heartless. Heartless. That word sat with me for a moment. How many times had I watched my brother gloat about his success while I was struggling? How many times had I been told I wasn't good enough, that I was a disappointment, that I would never measure up? And now that the roles were reversed, I was the heartless one? I clenched my jaw. I'm done with this conversation, Mom. Jake made his choices. Now he gets to live with them. And I hung up. I should have expected what happened next. Jake wasn't done playing victim. A few days later, I started getting messages from relatives. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who hadn't spoken to me in years were suddenly reaching out. Jake's in trouble, and you won't even help him? What kind of brother are you? Family comes first. No matter what happened in the past, you should be there for him now. You have more than enough to help. It wouldn't kill you to show a little generosity. I rolled my eyes at each message and ignored them all. Jake had gone full desperation mode, rallying the family to guilt trip me into bailing him out. But what he didn't understand was that I no longer cared about their opinions. The only thing I cared about was watching him finally face the consequences of his actions. And soon enough, those consequences were about to get worse. Much worse. A week passed, and for the first time in a while, things were quiet. No more calls from my parents, no more guilt-tripping texts from distant relatives, and no more messages from Jake. I should have known it was too good to last. One evening, as I was leaving my office, I noticed a figure standing near the parking lot. Even from a distance, I recognized him immediately. Jake. He looked worse than before. His usual confident, well-groomed appearance was gone. His suit was wrinkled again, but this time, it was clear he had been wearing it for far too long. His face looked gaunt, and there was a shadow of desperation in his eyes. I considered turning around and walking the other way, but before I could, he spotted me. "Ethan," he called out, jogging toward me. I sighed, bracing myself. "What do you want, Jake?" He forced a smile, like we were just two brothers catching up. "Man, it's been crazy lately. Everything's been falling apart, you know? It's just bad timing." I stayed silent. He exhaled sharply. "Look, I know I screwed up. I know I treated you like shit. But I'm not asking for much, just a little help. A loan. I swear I'll pay you back as soon as I get back on my feet." I stared at him. "And what happens if you don't get back on your feet?" He blinked, caught off guard. "What happens if, just like before, you keep spending money you don't have?" I continued. "What happens if, instead of paying me back, you go right back to trying to live like you're better than everyone else?" He scoffed. "That's not fair." I tilted my head. "Isn't it?" His jaw tightened. "Come on, man. I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice. You have no idea what it's like to lose everything." I let out a small laugh. "No, Jake. You have no idea what it's like to have nothing. You were always handed everything. And when I had nothing, you made sure I knew it." He looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I shook my head. "I'm not going to bail you out. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them." His face darkened. "So that's it. You're just going to watch me struggle. You didn't care when I struggled," I pointed out. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But then, something in his expression shifted. The desperation turned to anger. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he sneered. "Just because you got lucky?" I narrowed my eyes. "Lucky? Yeah," he snapped. "That's all this is. You got lucky with some stupid startup, and now you think you're untouchable. You think you're some big-shot success story. But let me tell you something. You're still just the same loser you always were. The only difference is a bigger bank account." I felt my hands clench into fists. Jake saw my reaction and smirked, thinking he had gotten to me. But instead of snapping, I just smiled. "Well," I said, "since I'm just a loser with a bigger bank account, I guess you won't be needing my money after all." His smirk faded instantly. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, speechless. I didn't look back. I had waited years for this moment, and it was more satisfying than I ever imagined. A few weeks passed, and I didn't hear from Jake again. The silence was almost unsettling. After all the desperate attempts to guilt-trip me, I expected at least one more last-ditch effort. But nothing. I thought maybe he had finally given up. I was wrong. One evening, just as I was locking up my office, I heard my phone buzz. A call from an unknown number. Normally, I ignored those, but something told me to answer. "Ethan." The voice on the other end was shaky, tired. It was Jake. For a moment, I considered hanging up, but curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want, Jake?" I asked, my tone flat. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I need help." I sighed, already knowing where this was going. "We've been through this. I'm not giving you money." "It's not about money," he muttered. I lost my apartment." I frowned. "What? They evicted me," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere to go." I leaned against my car, running a hand through my hair. "And what do you expect me to do about that?" He exhaled sharply. "I don't know, okay? I just thought maybe you'd let me crash with you for a little while." I almost laughed. "Are you serious?" "Ethan, I don't have anyone else," he said, and for the first time, I heard something real in his voice. Something I had never heard from Jake before. Fear. He wasn't just struggling anymore. He was drowning. For a moment, I considered it. The idea of my brother, the same brother who had looked down on me for years, now having to rely on me for shelter? The poetic justice of it was almost too perfect. But then I remembered who I was dealing with. Jake didn't change. Jake didn't learn. He was only here because he had no other option. And the second he found another way out, he would go right back to being the same arrogant, entitled person he had always been. "I can't help you," I said. Silence. "You won't even let me sleep on your couch?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "You wouldn't have let me sleep on yours," I replied simply. He let out a bitter laugh. "So that's it. You're just gonna let your own brother be homeless?" "I'm not the one who made you homeless, Jake," I said. "You did that all on your own." He muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite hear, and then he hung up. I stared at my phone for a long moment. I should have felt guilty, But I didn't. Jake had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, that he could treat people however he wanted and never face consequences. But reality had finally caught up to him, and for the first time in his life, there was no one left to save him. I thought that was the last I'd hear from Jake. That, finally, he had hit rock bottom and would be forced to figure things out on his own. I underestimated just how desperate he could get. A few days later, I came home late from work, exhausted. As I pulled into my driveway, something felt off. My house was dark, just as I had left it, but there was an unfamiliar shape on the front steps. As I got closer, I realized it was Jake. He was sitting there, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around himself like he was trying to disappear. For a second, I just stared at him. This wasn't the same Jake I had grown up with. The arrogant, smirking golden boy was gone. In his place was someone unrecognizable, someone hollow, beaten down. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could tell he knew I was there. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. He let out a shuddering breath. I didn't know where else to go. I sighed, rubbing my temple. "Jake, you can't just show up here." He finally looked at me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw a real desperation in his eyes. "Please, Ethan, just for one night. I don't even need a bed. I'll sleep on the floor. Just don't make me go back out there." I hesitated. Every instinct in me was telling me to turn him away. He had spent years tearing me down, making me feel like I was nothing. He had laughed while I struggled, and now he was asking me for mercy? But at the same time, he was still my brother. I exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of my nose. "One night," I said. "That's it." He nodded quickly, scrambling to his feet. "I swear, man, I won't be any trouble. I held up a hand. "I don't want excuses. Just get inside before I change my mind." Jake followed me in, and for the first time in his life, he didn't act like he owned the place. He kept his head down, his movements cautious, like he was afraid I'd throw him out at any second. I grabbed a blanket from the closet and tossed it onto the couch. "You sleep here. No wandering around. No going through my stuff. You're out first thing in the morning." "Yeah," he muttered. "Of course." I didn't say anything else. I just turned and went to my room, locking the door behind me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Jake wasn't the type to accept consequences. He never had been. And letting him back in, even for one night, I had a feeling I was about to regret it. I barely slept that night. Even though I had locked my bedroom door, my instincts wouldn't let me relax. Years of knowing Jake had taught me one thing. When he was desperate, he was dangerous. Not in a physical way, but in the way he could manipulate, twist words, and take advantage of any situation to get what he wanted. When I finally got up the next morning, I half expected to find him rummaging through my things, looking for cash or valuables to pawn. Instead, I found him exactly where I had left him, on the couch, curled up under the blanket. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, like a kid who had been left out in the cold. For a second, a part of me almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered every time I had felt that way before, every time I had given him the benefit of the doubt, only to have him prove me wrong. I walked into the kitchen and started making coffee, not bothering to be quiet. He stirred at the noise, groaning slightly as he sat up. "Morning," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah," I said. "It is." He looked around, as if surprised to find himself still here. "Thanks for letting me stay. I mean it." I didn't answer. I just poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Look, man, I know I said one night, but I was wondering." "No." He blinked. "What? You need to leave," I said, my voice firm. "Now." His face fell. "Come on, Ethan. Just a couple more days. I'll find a job. I'll figure things out. I just need a little more time." I shook my head. "Not my problem." His jaw tightened. "Seriously? After everything?" I let out a sharp laugh. "Everything? You mean after a lifetime of you treating me like garbage? After years of watching you get handed everything while I had to fight for scraps? After all the times you could have helped me, but chose to humiliate me instead?" He flinched. "I was an idiot back then, okay? I didn't know any better." I scoffed. "No, Jake. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think the tables would ever turn." His desperation was turning into anger now. "So that's it? You're just gonna throw me out like I'm nothing?" I set my coffee down and crossed my arms. "I didn't make you nothing, Jake. You did that to yourself." His nostrils flared, and for a second, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he just shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're a real piece of work, you know that?" he spat. "You think you're better than me just because you got lucky?" "Lucky?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You had every advantage, every opportunity, and you threw it all away." "I didn't get lucky, Jake. I worked for everything I have. Something you've never done in your entire life." His fist clenched, but he had no comeback. Because deep down, he knew I was right. I stepped aside and pointed to the door. "Get out." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, he grabbed his shoes, stood up, and walked toward the door. Just as he was about to step outside, he paused. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I smirked. "No, I won't." And then I shut the door in his face. I stood there for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade away. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. For the first time in years, I felt like I had finally closed the chapter on Jake. But I should have known better. Jake had never been the type to walk away quietly. A few days passed without any contact, and I started to think he had finally learned his lesson. But then, the messages started again. Not from him. This time, it was my parents. "Mom, Ethan, what is wrong with you? Your brother came to you for help, and you threw him out like garbage? Dad, we raised you better than this. How can you be so selfish?" I rolled my eyes at every message. The irony was almost laughable. When I had been struggling, when I had needed just a fraction of the support they had given Jake, they had turned their backs on me without hesitation. But now that their golden boy was down and out, suddenly, family loyalty mattered. I ignored the texts. Then they started calling. At first, I let every call go to voicemail. But after a full week of nonstop attempts, I finally picked up, more out of exhaustion than anything else. The moment I answered, my mother's voice came through, sharp and angry. "Do you even care about this family anymore?" I took a slow breath, keeping my voice calm. "What do you want, Mom?" "Jake is homeless," she snapped. "Your own brother is living on the street, and you won't even lift a finger to help him?" I let out a small laugh. "I'm supposed to believe Jake is actually homeless?" "He's staying in shelters," she said, her voice growing more desperate. "He has nothing, Ethan." I leaned against my desk. "And whose fault is that?" She went quiet for a moment. "Mom," I continued, "he had every opportunity, every advantage, and he wasted all of it. That's not my responsibility." "You think you're so much better than him," she snapped. "I don't think I'm better," I said. "I just think I'm not stupid enough to make the same mistakes over and over again." "You're being cruel," she whispered. I sighed. "No, Mom, I'm just done." And with that, I hung up. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, the guilt-tripping only escalated. My parents tried every tactic they could think of: anger, manipulation, even pretending to be proud of me in a pathetic attempt to soften me up. But I wasn't falling for it. Then, one day, I got a message that made me pause. It wasn't from my parents. It was from Jake. "I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve your help. But I'm out of options. Just one last chance, man. Please." It was different from the other messages. There was no entitlement, no bitterness, just raw desperation. For a moment, I actually considered responding. Then I remembered all the other times I had fallen for his apologies. Jake had never truly been sorry. He had just been sorry about the consequences. I deleted the message without replying. For the first time in my life, I was done cleaning up my brother's messes. And for the first time in his life, he was going to have to figure things out on his own. Weeks passed, then months. For the first time in my life, I didn't have Jake or my parents breathing down my neck, telling me I owed them something. And you know what? It felt amazing. Without the constant stress of their manipulations, I was finally able to focus entirely on myself. My business continued to grow. I expanded, hiring more employees and opening a second location. I started traveling more, meeting new people, enjoying my success in a way I never had before. I had spent so much of my life chasing their approval, trying to prove to them that I was worth something. And now that I had finally let go of that need, I was happier than I had ever been. I didn't hear anything about Jake for a long time. Then, one afternoon, I ran into an old mutual friend from high school. "Dude," he said, shaking his head. "I heard about Jake. That's crazy." I frowned. "What about him?" "You don't know?" He looked surprised. "Man, he really fell hard. I saw him the other day. He was working at that gas station off 8th Street. Looked rough." I blinked. "Jake? Working a minimum wage job?" That was the same Jake who used to mock people in customer service jobs. The same Jake who had always bragged about how he would never settle for anything less than 6 figures. And now, he was the one behind the counter. I didn't know how to feel about that. There was no satisfaction in hearing it. No sense of victory. Just closure. For the first time, Jake was living in reality. No more handouts. No more safety nets. Just the consequences of his own choices. I never went to see him. Never reached out. Because I didn't need to. I had already won. Not because I had more money. Not because I had more success. But because, for the first time in my life, I was free. And that was worth more than anything.